competence-based marking key criteria beyond grade. That's by Sara Marsham from Newcastle, Sarah Gretton from Leicester, and Don from Hull. Over to you. And we are recording. We'll leave time at the end for questions, by the way, as well.
Should be plenty of time for questions. So I offered to start this one. I apologise because obviously I'm speaking quite a lot today, but hopefully it's useful stuff. So I think it was just to introduce one of the parts of the CBAS framework is this stage 3. So a lot of the first part of today is focused on stage 1, which is about sort of deciding those program outcomes and deciding what it is that the program's working towards. Stage 2 is about the overall assessment strategy. Stage 3, part 3, is about the actual implementation of assessment, and there are three aspects of the implementation assessment, which are the preparation of the student to do the work, the grading of the work, once it has sort of that grading process that stretches from making sure that it's part of that preparation. Students know what good is and how they're going to be assessed, and then the sort of the feedback process and closing the closing the loop, as it were. There will be a recording. There will be a recording afterwards to answer the question in the chat. Yes, so three parts of it, and this sort of boils down into, we want students to have the competence to complete the assessment well. So then we want them to enter into the assessment process with confidence. We want them to know what it is that they're expected to do, how to do it well, and to have some tools to implement, to help them through that process. So it's not just a case of all go and work together. They've got some ideas about what professional collaboration means and some processes that will help them do that. So the briefings are a really important part of the assessment process. Then, sort of tied into some of the things that we've discussed about what the purpose of a grade is and what it means, and sort of making sure that employers and students understand what it is that they've developed. We want the grading process to reflect the outcomes, the things that we actually want the students to develop. The fundamental point being that we want the grade to be meaningful. And finally, we don't want feedback to be an add-on. Feedback is fundamentally that process about creating developmental loops, about helping students understand what it is that are developing and guiding them to where they can go. It's not about explaining why they've got a specific grade on that assignment. It's a broader part of the developmental process, and should tie together what they're taught, how they're graded, and then how to develop going forward. So we've got 3 case studies that are sort of that broadly look at different aspects of this, or this part from three different institutional perspectives. And we're going to start with Sara's perspective from Newcastle. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks, Dom. So hello again, everyone. If you weren't here this morning, I'm Sara Marsham. I'm from Newcastle University. And as part of our project to develop competences, we had a working group that was tasked with developing assessment criteria linked to the competences. So if any of you were here this morning, I said that we developed 9 competences. On the screen there, you can see 10. So in the end, we did decide to split data literacy and digital literacy apart, but we are still going round on this, because when it actually came to developing the assessment criteria, at one point we did have them separate. We then put them together. They are currently separate again. Who knows what will happen with that? But if you can just advance the slide, please, Dom. So here are the 10 competencies that we agreed on. So as part of the working group, I was sort of tasked with leading it. And as I started thinking about how am I going to even start writing these assessment criteria for each competency, I got an email through inviting me to a series of workshops about using generative AI to write assessment rubrics. And it was just perfectly timed. So I signed myself up to that. I went along and it was absolutely brilliant. I've put the link there, but I'll put the link in the chat as well. It's an open access resource for anyone to utilise. And the bit I actually found most valuable from this was having the time set aside in the workshop. So the first workshop gave us the background and the theory. The second workshop actually gave us space to develop our rubrics using AI and sort of supportive prompts to that. So actually setting aside time in my diary to attend a workshop and give me the space really, really helped. If you can advance the slide, please, Dom. Sorry. So like Ruth at Chester this morning, I use Copilot, and what I put into Copilot were for each competency, I put in the competency descriptor, I put in stage descriptors, I put in prompts linked to the FHEQ, different levels, put in what the grade boundaries were that I wanted to do. And after some, iteration, I did end up with a set of assessment criteria for each competency at each stage. So at level 4, level 5 and level 6, that I then felt were in a position to share with others. If you could advance the slide, please, Dom. So what I did was then I worked with our working group. So we had a small group of academic colleagues. So there was about 4 or 5 of us. And we then split up our competencies. We took a couple each and we revised them. So we worked through them. We looked at them from a student perspective. We looked at them from a progression perspective. So on the screen there is the competency for information literacy. So you'll see the stage descriptor. So what was the descriptor at level 4, level 5, level 6 that we already had defined as a group. And then you can see the grade boundary descriptor across the different boundaries. And we refine these to use a shared language across them, but as I said, to also recognise the progression from level 4 to level 5 to level 6. We also looked at the QAA benchmark statements again, and some of the documentation provided by some of the accrediting bodies and what they were looking for within our degree programmes. Last advance, please, Tom. Thank you. So this is the position that we're in. So we have a set of assessment criteria like this for each of the 10 competencies. Our next step is to get input on these from our teaching groups and our external examiners and our students. One thing that we also need to think about is how we combine these with assessment specific criteria. So for example, if we're assessing a presentation, do we want a criterion around the presentation element? If we're assessing a written report, do we want a criterion around sort of organisation structure, that sort of thing? So that's our next step. And really the ideal is that we will have these as a pick and mix, so that when an assessment is set that aligns to each of those competencies, our colleagues can take the correct criterion, they can add in any additional ones around assessment specificity, and then they can use that to develop their criteria. At present, we already do information literacy sessions or assessment literacy sessions with our students where we show them criteria, we give them exemplars, we give them the opportunity to mark those exemplars against criteria so that they can see what they're doing. So we will have to revise those sessions and build those into our timetable so that all students have the opportunity to fully understand what these assessment criteria are. Thank you very much. And I think I'm handing over to Sarah.
So I'm going to talk about another example. For a number of years, I was director of the Natural Sciences programme at the University of Leicester. I should say I'm also a biologist by trade. And what I wanted to talk about was, I suppose, a slightly different but similar approach to what Sara's talked about in terms of designing rubrics. Now, what I should say probably is hold my hands up here is that our university doesn't have a competency-based or formally have a competency-based approach to assessment. We do, I think, we do try and incorporate a transferable skills framework, and that's part of the work that goes behind designing our programmable outcomes, but it's not a specific terminology that I was familiar with until I got on board with this project. But I think what we've done here is really think about have I think quite a lot of inherent competencies within our programme and how we try and translate those, or how we work with staff to try and translate those into rubrics and marking for the students. So if I move on to the next slide, I can explain that a little bit more. So what I suppose our natural sciences programme is very much built around a number of what we call problem-based learning assessments, and problem-based learning is really a set of open-ended problems that students work on in groups. And as part of, I suppose, the problem-based learning pedagogy, there's a lot of, I suppose, transferable skills which are sort of embedded within that kind of framework. And so just to give you a couple of examples here, we were essentially going through a revalidation process, or a revamp, I should say, sort of the programme. And we'd already used some of these authentic assessments in the previous version of the programme, and we're going to continue using them in the relaunch. And you can see the examples that we've got written here. And I think what we're really thinking about here is actually trying to understand the skills that these authentic assessments should, or aspirations for what they should be developing. And I suppose, say, skills and competencies is really what we were doing, but we didn't realise it at the time. And what we wanted to really think about this was a programmatic set of rubrics which really articulated the students what we're expecting of them as part of these open-ended authentic assessments, but also how they could, just let me remove my feline friend from the presentation, but really thinking about, I think has been alluded to already, but thinking about that feedback at feed forwards, and supporting students to understand how the assessments relate to each other, and actually that there was some programmatic coherence in terms of the assessments that we had embedded into the course. So we have essentially within the programme, we have a kind of core set of modules that all of the natural sciences students do, and we'd spent quite a bit of time thinking about which assessments fell where, what type of authentic assessments they were, what skills they're developing, and how those skills and those competencies, I suppose, were developed throughout the programme. And I think what we wanted to do was make sure that our assessments rubrics essentially mirrored what was in our heads in terms of the programmatic design. So we've moved to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we were having a sort of revamp of the programme at this point, just sort of, I suppose, curriculum transformation really, and changing some of the sort of core modules and thinking about these core themes throughout the programme. And so in terms of developing the rubrics, what I was really keen to do was to think about having, I suppose, the key people who are responsible for the design and also I suppose for the majority of the marking actually, from these different authentic assessments to actually work together. So natural sciences interdisciplinary programme, and we have discipline leads from the areas that you can see listed just here. And what I wanted our programme, I suppose, the discipline leads to do is to really think about collaboratively actually how we take, I suppose, essentially agree on a set of core criteria, which I think loosely inherited from our programme learning outcomes, and think about how we actually go about aligning those to a specific set of criteria for rubrics. So we were helped at the time by Phil Marston. I have to give him a lot of credit. He was an education developer that worked at the university at the time. He's since left, and he really helped us to go beyond that stage of mapping the core criteria, but also to think about turning those into rubrics themselves. So what we were really trying to do there was avoid terms like vague descriptors like excellent or weak, but really try and articulate, once we had those core criteria, what a first or a third looked like for those, using the magic numbers and trying to encourage staff to use the full marking range. And I think within that, it's focusing on these specific observable competencies. So we spent a lot of time in rooms with whiteboards and thinking about our different assessments. And Sara talked about was that what we wanted to create was a sort of master rubric where different module conveners or assessors within, or people assessing assessments within modules could actually take that master rubric, as I say, sort of pick a mix and think, well, these are the sort of overall set of criteria. Which ones will I pick between those? So I know this because the version that we currently give to staff at the moment is version 6. So we went through 6 different versions, essentially iterating on our approach. So I went away with Phil and did some of, I suppose, a bit more desk work around it, but adjusting the descriptors and particularly thinking about how we had the same essentially sort of broad framework across the 4 years of our degree programme, but what transitions we're expecting between the different year groups. So how we mapped that from level 4 to level 7. And then thinking about how we've got module learning outcomes and how we link what we're doing there to the module learning outcomes as well, particularly when they were knowledge based as well. So move on to the next slide. So what hopefully we've arrived at, and I think what was most important about this process isn't actually the marking rubrics that we arrived at, but the conversations that happened to enable us. So that shared vision of that shared set of criteria that we could use across a diverse set of authentic assessments. And I think that really comes back to that, although we weren't strictly following the competency-based sort of framework at the time, actually that's what we were thinking about, was actually what are the set of competencies that we want, that we think are being assessed by these set of assessments, and therefore how can we articulate this clearly to students. And I think that was something that we were quite conscious of in the programme revamp, is that if you have got very open-ended these kind of authentic problem-based learning type assessments, actually sometimes it's very hard for the students to work out what. I think, that's the whole nature of open-endedness, is they've got to establish what they're doing. And I think what we wanted them to spend time doing is to exploring the open-ended nature of a scientific problem, not trying to understand what they were going to be assessed against. And so I think it's about having the appropriate open-endedness. So that's maybe the scientific problem part of it, but not that they should be thinking, I'm not sure, what criteria will be marked against and what good would look like. So as I mentioned, the flexibility about removing particular non-relevant rows, and I'll show you an example in a moment, and then hopefully this provided clear articulation to the student about what was expected, and also as part of the rubric we sort of put in some information about assessment weightings. And I'm going to talk a little bit later, I think it's in the actual fact later, it'll be in the next presentation, about reflection, because I think that's quite important. But I think that fits into the whole theme here of this basis for students to be able to understand their development of a skill or a competency, to be able to track that and to see how that moves. They move in terms of that development throughout a programme. And I think hopefully that, as I said in this sort of final point here, this is, supporting academic judgment, but I think it's also about that transparency for student learning as well. So I think if we move to the next slide, if that's all right. I've just given you a quick example here, and what we've actually done with this, and this is, I think, quite interesting, and I'm not sure, I'm going to be honest and say that, I'm not an expert on this, it was just something we've tried, but what we were quite conscious of is with these open-ended authentic assessments is that we have learning objectives at a session level. So essentially we have for each workshop, or if we have a sort of lecture type event, that we'd have workshops there. And what we wanted to be explicit about for the students is often they might have more than one open-ended assessment on the module, and where the knowledge mapped particular assessments. And so actually what we did at the start of, as you can see here at the top of the rubric, is actually talk about, and these are very much sort of knowledge-based objectives. So, learning about or understanding, being able to apply a particular theorem, for example. And what we want to be really clear here was about this is the knowledge that's being tested, essentially. And so we do actually have what we sort of delineated, and I'll be interested to see people's thoughts on this, because I'm not sure if we took the right approach or not, but we actually had a criteria which was around core knowledge, and that's essentially assessing the knowledge around the workshop objectives. So just to be really clear about what the students were the kind of open-ended science that students are expected to explore as part of the authentic assessment. Now, I've not included them all here, but I think hopefully you can get an idea. What I thought was really interesting was that, yours went in one direction and ours go in the other direction. So we have the higher descriptors on the left-hand side as opposed to the right-hand side. And I don't know what that says about whether I've got like a more, I don't know, about different approaches to high and low or something like that. But I just thought it was interesting that we ordered ours in the other direction. But what you can see here is just some of the examples of the criteria that we all agreed assessments would or could be assessed against. So we've got, for example, use of sources, structure, data representation. So I think this very much kind of falls into the sort of competency type framework, that way of thinking about them. And this is really what we wanted, I think, to hopefully articulate to the students, is that these are the kind of competencies that would cut across multiple different assessments, and particularly if you're using, I suppose, a model where you've got multiple authentic assessments as well. So I think that's probably, is this my last slide, I think? Yes, that's right. So, yeah, I think it's over to you.
Right. So I think something that's come across quite clearly is the importance of the discussion around the rubric, and I think one of the sort of the key aspects of marking criteria is about developing this shared understanding of what makes something good. And so when you're looking at a piece of work, or you're looking at assignments, okay, well, by what dimensions are we defining goodness? And do those align with what we want the program to do? And it's really important to recognize that there's lots of different stakeholders in this that need to understand goodness. So it's the staff collectively. Increasingly more and more I've seen people talking about modules with 400 plus students. Presumably in that context, it's not just one lecturer marking all of that work. So you've got teams of people working together that need to have a shared understanding of goodness. You've got the students that need to understand what it is that they're working to, but also to help them articulate what they've learned, what they've done well, where they need to improve. So it has a lot of value for that. And then, as we've discussed earlier, the value for employers in terms of understanding, well, we've said a student has a first, well, what did they actually have to do to get that first? When we've said that they've created first level pieces of work, or how are we defining goodness, and does that align with what they need graduates to be able to do, or society needs graduates to be able to do? And I think that starting point is really helpful, and one of the things that I really like about the competence-based approach is it helps you think about assignments and break down assignments not as, is this a good assignment or a bad assignment, but what the assignment tells us about the student, what it tells us about their competence. And that's what the purpose of assessment is to help develop the student's competence. And so we need to make sure that the marking criteria is supporting that. So the approach that we've taken within our school, within Hull, is to break up competencies into 4 defining features of goodness. So each row of the rubric, so whether that's information literacy or problem solving, there are 4 things that define its goodness. And those are the things that we teach to the students when we're providing the training. So if we're teaching them about problem solving, we might teach them a particular problem solving approach, or that when they do problem solving, they need to consider 4 things. And then what we're doing when we're looking at the assignment is we're looking for evidence that they've met those 4 those 4 components of goodness. So in this context, this is one that we've developed for anything that has sort of visual elements like posters or presentations, or particularly infographics is my particular thing that I'm really interested in. And I teach the visual design component for our bioscientists, and I teach them about these components when I'm training them to do that well. And then when I look at the marking criteria, I look to see whether these have been achieved. And then a student gets a grade for that row based on the number of those things that they've achieved. So if they achieve all of them to the satisfaction for the level, then they get a 65 for that component of the marking criteria. And I find that really helpful when I'm marking and for students, because the students get a very short list of what goodness is. It's often 16 points of goodness, which I think is quite, and I encourage them to use it as a checklist. So they go to, have I done this? Have I done this? Have I done this? Have I done this at the end? And I think that helps with the point that was made earlier about students reading a whole rubric. And from our perspective, instead of having to say, oh, well, this is exactly what a 2-1 is for this component of the marking criteria, we can just say, well, we don't care about that. It's just if they haven't met the definitions of goodness, then they don't get a 2-1. So I find that quite a sort of helpful way of thinking about it. And then what we have is an Excel spreadsheet where the feedback is kept. So what happens is, if a student has minor issues for one component of this, then there'll be an Excel, there'll be a cell that you can copy and paste into the feedback sections. You can pick 3 areas of strength, 3 areas for improvement, and a most important thing for next time. And that sort of helps reduce the timing related to doing the marking, but also helps make sure that your feedback is linking back into the training, linking back into development. So this is an example of a most important thing for next time, related to where a student hasn't really engaged with the purpose of the assessment in an authentic way, and then that's the comment that they'll get back. So that's sort of three different ways of looking at sort of very similar things, but I think that whole that sort of broader approach of particularly working together as a team, everyone who's going to be doing the assessing to develop, allowing students to have a look at that to make sure that they've understood it, that iterative process, and using it to enhance student growth. I really liked that idea about having the leveled approach, where this is what it looks like at level 4 and level 5 and level 6. So I thought that was really nice with the Newcastle approach to see how it grows through. So I think that is our time. And I can see that there's lots of chat being going on that I've not been able to monitor whilst I've been.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. I think it's do we a little bit of time for questions?
Yeah, we do. We've got about 1 minute. We can extend that for a couple of minutes. Very interesting one. I'm just looking from Caroline, who's asking about interdisciplinary. Just going back to it so that I can articulate that correctly. Interdisciplinary courses and how you might write the competencies rubrics for an interdisciplinary course.
I would say, Sarah, are you in the best thing? Is you're on the natural sciences?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I think it maybe depends what you mean by interdisciplinary, because I suppose our students took a core set of modules for which the modules themselves are interdisciplinary, and so that's when we got all the people involved in the assessment and marking into a room together so that we could understand what a chemist and a physicist and a biologist all thought, I don't know, critical thinking looked like or something like that. But I would say I also use these marking criteria this kind of approach with the master rubric, I say, is what I've drawn from for a set of marking criteria for an interdisciplinary module I run, which has got students from multiple different discipline background in their final year. It's the sustainability module, and again it's an authentic assessment. It's about writing a sustainability audit report, and so I use the same approach there because I think the categories or the criteria are based on quite broad, so things like report structure, ability to use sources correctly. Core knowledge for that would be around sustainability. I'm not sure if that answers your question, and I know it's Caroline that had the problem with the microphone before, so I'm not sure if that answers your question, Caroline, but that was what I was thinking, is that I think it's just about making sure that everyone understands the criteria. There's that collective understanding, but I think, if you think about competencies, if we fight back to the start of the day, thinking about program competencies, then there are competencies that cut across entire institutions. So I think it's about what's in common at an interdisciplinary level and making sure you've included those.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I'll just do one more then. So we've got from Matthew Hillier, do you have a holistic category criteria? I found it is possible for a student to meet the micro items in the rubric. However, the work overall does not work at a holistic level. So we're going back into a level conversation here.
I say I'm happy to answer that one because that was one of the sort of the foundational precepts for this bit, which was, so you can't, so this is the whole of the marking criteria. And this was the thing that I found. So if you have a box that says, a student's done this, this and this, and that's a 2-1 for structure, if they've done some aspects of that but not others, do they get a 2-1? Are there some parts that are more foundational? So, maybe for something like structure, maybe a student's written it in really nice sentences, but it's all just like as a single block. And it's like, well, that maybe they fail because they've not used paragraphs or or something like that. So the thing that I found really helpful with this is to break that down. Instead of saying, oh well, we expect this at this level, this at this level, this at this level, this at this level, is just say, well, actually good is this, and if they've done all of those things as good, they get a 2-1, and if they've missed one of those things, then they get a 2-2, and if they've missed 2 of those things, then they get a third, and 3 things they get a just fail, and if they 4 things, then they fail. And I find that massively reduces my cognitive load when I'm marking, because I'm not trying to map where it is. I'm just going through and going tick, tick, tick. Have they done this? Have they done that? Have they? And does it exceed it, meet it, or not? So yeah, I think that was one of the sort of, for me, and also to avoid that the structure is excellent, the structure is good, the structure is adequate. Thing is like, well, actually, when we say something is excellent, or when we say something is good, what does that actually mean? So yeah, so I think it's an attempt to avoid or to take the good bits of the reductionist, because the thing that we want to be reductionist about is our definition of good, not our definition of a third, our definition of a fail. And if we can agree on good, then we can work out where a student is relative to that, I suppose. I don't know how the others feel about that, but
thanks for that, Dom.